Nobody expected the empty chair to become the most important seat at our Christmas dinner. My name is Margaret Collins, and at 68 years old, I believed I had already learned every lesson life could teach me about love, loss, and family. I was wrong. The hardest lesson arrived wrapped in red ribbons, glowing Christmas lights, and the comforting smell of roasted turkey drifting through the home my late husband and I had built together more than 35 years earlier. That morning, I woke before sunrise, just as I had every Christmas since Daniel was a little boy. Outside, a thin layer of fresh snow covered the front yard, making everything look peaceful. Inside, I tied on my favorite red apron and began preparing dinner. The turkey had been brining overnight, the pecan pie was cooling on the counter, and fresh rolls were rising beneath a clean kitchen towel. Every ornament on the tree carried a memory. Every stocking hanging above the fireplace reminded me of someone I loved. I paused for a moment in front of my husband's framed photograph on the mantel. "I hope you'd be proud of tonight," I whispered before smoothing my sweater and returning to the kitchen. By 4 o'clock, the house smelled exactly the way Christmas was supposed to smell. Cinnamon, butter, rosemary, and coffee blended into something warm enough to make strangers feel like family. Daniel arrived first with his wife, Rebecca. She stepped inside carrying an expensive dessert from a downtown bakery, smiling just brightly enough to impress anyone who didn't know her well. "The house looks beautiful," she said, glancing around before immediately rearranging the serving trays I had already placed on the dining table. Daniel kissed my cheek, but his attention drifted back to Rebecca before I could ask how work had been. Soon the grandchildren filled the living room with laughter. Holiday music played softly from the old record player, and wrapping paper began collecting beneath the tree. Looking around, I wanted to believe everything was finally normal again after my husband's passing the previous year. We gathered around the dining table just before sunset. I reached for the chair where I had always sat beside my husband during every Christmas dinner we had ever hosted. Then I stopped. My place card was gone. In its place sat a small folded card written in elegant gold lettering. I picked it up slowly, expecting someone had made an innocent mistake. Instead, it read only one word: guest. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Rebecca glanced toward me with a pleasant smile that never quite reached her eyes. Daniel looked down at his plate as though he suddenly found the mashed potatoes fascinating. I felt the room grow strangely quiet despite the crackling fireplace and cheerful music still drifting from the next room. It was only a single word on a small piece of cardstock. But somehow, in the house where I had celebrated every Christmas for decades, it quietly suggested that I no longer belonged. I smiled, set the card back on the table, and took the only empty seat left. In that moment, everyone believed they understood exactly who I had become. They had no idea Christmas had only just begun. I quietly unfolded my napkin and thanked Rebecca for organizing the seating, even though we both knew I had arranged every holiday dinner in this house for more than 3 decades. She responded with a smile polished enough for a magazine advertisement. "We thought it would make things feel fresh this year," she said as she reached for the serving spoon before I could lift it. Daniel nodded without looking at me. "It is just a small change, Mom." Small. That word lingered in my mind longer than it should have. Families rarely fall apart because of one enormous moment. They drift apart through hundreds of small moments that everyone pretends are too insignificant to matter. I watched Rebecca serve everyone else first. She knew exactly how each person liked their meal. White meat for Daniel. Extra cranberry sauce for our oldest granddaughter, Emma. More stuffing for our grandson, Caleb. By the time she reached me, the platter was nearly empty. "Oh, I am so sorry," she said softly. "I did not realize we were running low." I smiled and told her not to worry. There was still plenty in the kitchen. I stood and carried my plate back to the counter, where I carefully sliced another portion from the turkey I had spent hours preparing. As I returned, I noticed something else. The conversation flowed easily around me, but never through me. They discussed a family ski trip planned for February. They laughed about restaurant reservations they had all enjoyed together earlier that month. They talked about school events, neighborhood gatherings, and weekend dinners. Every story sounded new to me. Not because I had forgotten, but because no one had invited me. Every laugh gently reminded me of memories created without me. The grandchildren remained kind, asking whether I still baked cinnamon rolls on Saturday mornings and whether I would make my famous sugar cookies again before New Year's Day. Their innocence was the only warmth that reached my side of the table. Children often notice kindness before adults remember it exists. As dessert was served, Rebecca stood and tapped her glass with a spoon. "Before everyone leaves, I have a few ideas about next year," she announced cheerfully. She spoke about renovating the dining room, replacing furniture, updating the kitchen, and modernizing the house. She said everything as though the decisions had already been made. Daniel agreed with every suggestion before anyone else could speak. I rested my hands around a warm coffee mug and listened. The walls around us held photographs from every Christmas since Daniel was 5 years old. My husband had hung every picture himself. I remembered him standing on a ladder, laughing because he could never make the frames perfectly straight. Looking at those photographs now felt like looking through a window into someone else's life. Rebecca eventually turned toward me. "You deserve less responsibility now," she said kindly enough that anyone overhearing would have mistaken it for compassion. "You should finally relax and let the younger generation take over." The room grew quiet for only a second before conversation resumed. I simply nodded and took another sip of coffee. No one realized that the silence around me had begun telling a story far louder than any words spoken across that Christmas table. After everyone finished dessert, the grandchildren hurried into the living room to sort through board games while soft Christmas music continued playing in the background. I gathered the empty plates and carried them into the kitchen out of habit. Before I could turn on the faucet, Rebecca gently touched my arm. "You do not have to worry about cleaning anymore," she said. "We should start getting you used to taking it easy." Her words sounded thoughtful, but something about the way she emphasized the word start unsettled me. I smiled politely and stepped aside, watching her load the dishwasher without once asking where anything belonged. Every cabinet she opened had once been organized with my husband. Every drawer held memories she could not possibly know. A few minutes later, I returned to the dining room to collect the table linens. That was when I noticed Daniel and Rebecca standing quietly near the front hallway. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. Daniel forced a smile that looked uncomfortable. Rebecca's expression changed almost instantly into cheerful warmth. "We were just talking about next year," she said. I nodded as though I believed her, but years of raising a son had taught me to recognize the difference between surprise and guilt. My husband used to say that people reveal the truth in the seconds before they decide which words to speak. As the evening slowly came to an end, coats were collected, leftovers were packed into containers, and hugs were exchanged. Rebecca insisted on taking charge of dividing the remaining food. I noticed she carefully set aside several containers for herself before asking whether I wanted anything left from the dinner I had cooked. Once again, I answered with a smile. After the cars disappeared down the snow-covered street, silence settled over the house. The Christmas lights reflected softly across the windows, making the empty dining room feel even larger than it had only hours before. I picked up the small place card that still rested beside my plate. "Guest." I turned it over, wondering whether someone had simply written the wrong word by accident. The back was blank. No explanation. No apology. Only that single word. I slipped it into the pocket of my sweater instead of throwing it away. Something told me I would need to remember exactly how tonight had felt. As I walked through the quiet house, I paused beside the bookshelf where my husband's old address book still rested. Without fully understanding why, I reached for it. Tucked between two yellowed pages was a business card I had not noticed in years. It belonged to Grace Harper, the attorney who had handled several legal matters for my husband before he passed away. Almost at that exact moment, my cell phone rang. The screen displayed a name I had not seen in over a year. Grace Harper. I answered with a quiet hello. Her familiar voice remained calm and steady. "Margaret," she said gently, "I hope I am not calling too late. There is something your husband asked me to give you, but only if the time ever came when you truly needed to know the truth. After everything that happened tonight, I believe that time has arrived." The next morning arrived wrapped in quiet stillness. Fresh snow rested on the porch railing, and the neighborhood looked untouched, as though the previous evening had never happened. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching a pair of cardinals hop across the backyard. My husband's favorite birds always seemed to appear after the first snowfall. For a moment, I almost expected him to step into the kitchen carrying the morning newspaper with that familiar smile that had always made every problem seem smaller. Instead, my telephone rested on the counter, waiting. At exactly 9 o'clock it rang again. "Good morning, Margaret," Grace said gently. "Would you be comfortable meeting me today?" Her voice carried the same calm confidence I remembered from years ago. "Of course," I replied. "Is everything all right?" There was a brief pause before she answered. "I think it is time you learned something your husband hoped you would never need to know." An hour later, I walked into her small downtown office. Nothing had changed. The shelves were still lined with thick leather-bound law books, and a small Christmas wreath hung beside the window. Grace welcomed me with a warm embrace before placing a large cream-colored envelope on the conference table. My name appeared on the front in my husband's unmistakable handwriting. My hands trembled as I traced each familiar letter with my fingertips. "He left this with me 3 years before he passed away," Grace explained quietly. "His instructions were very specific. I was only to deliver it if I believed you had begun to lose your place within your own family." My throat tightened. I slowly opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter resting on top of several neatly organized legal documents. The first sentence stopped me completely. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has happened that I prayed never would." Tears gathered in my eyes, but I continued reading. He wrote about the years we built our home together, about every Christmas we had celebrated around the same dining table, and about how grateful he was for the kindness that had filled our marriage. Then his words became more serious. He explained that people sometimes changed when comfort replaced gratitude and when inheritance became more important than relationships. He asked me never to confuse silence with weakness or patience with surrender. Grace quietly slid another folder toward me. "There is more," she said. Inside were copies of legal documents I had never seen before. Everything had been signed properly years earlier. There was a family trust, detailed letters of instruction, and several provisions that would only become active under very specific circumstances. Grace did not explain everything immediately. Instead, she allowed me to read at my own pace while she poured 2 cups of tea. As I turned another page, I realized my husband had anticipated possibilities I had never imagined. He had not prepared those documents because he distrusted me. He had prepared them because he loved me enough to protect my dignity long after he could no longer stand beside me. When I finally looked up, Grace met my eyes with quiet understanding. "Margaret," she said softly, "your husband believed that character always reveals itself with time. From what you have told me about Christmas dinner, I believe he was right." When I left Grace's office that afternoon, the winter air felt different. The cold had not disappeared, but it no longer reached quite as deeply. For the first time since my husband passed away, I understood that he had not simply left me memories. He had left me wisdom, patience, and a plan built on the belief that truth would eventually reveal itself. I drove home slowly, passing neighborhoods decorated with wreaths and sparkling lights. Families were still celebrating the holiday season, carrying wrapped gifts into warm homes, laughing together on front porches, and waving to neighbors. I wondered how many of them realized that the greatest gifts were never placed beneath a tree. They were found in loyalty, respect, and simple acts of kindness. When I stepped inside my own house, everything remained exactly as I had left it. The Christmas tree still glowed softly in the corner. The empty coffee cups from the night before were neatly stacked beside the sink. The place card with the word guest remained safely tucked inside my sweater pocket. I placed it inside the same envelope that held my husband's letter. Somehow those 2 pieces of paper belonged together. One represented everything I had lost. The other reminded me of everything I still possessed. My telephone buzzed just before dinner. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Mom, Rebecca and I have been talking," he said. "We think it might be a good idea to start making plans for the future." Nothing urgent, of course. We just want to make sure you are comfortable. I thanked him for his concern and listened quietly as he spoke about smaller homes, retirement communities, and how difficult it must be for one person to maintain such a large house. He never once asked whether I wanted to leave. The decision already seemed to exist in his mind. I answered gently. Perhaps we should all sit down after the holidays and discuss everything together. He sounded relieved. That sounds perfect, Mom. After we ended the call, I looked again at the legal documents Grace had organized for me. Every page reflected careful planning rather than revenge. My husband had never wanted conflict. He had wanted fairness. He believed that every person should have the opportunity to reveal their true character before facing the consequences of their own choices. That evening, I wrote several notes on a yellow legal pad. I listed dates, conversations, and small details that suddenly seemed important. Rebecca changing the seating arrangement. The conversations that had excluded me. The discussion about renovating my home without asking my opinion. Daniel agreeing before thinking. None of those moments alone seemed extraordinary. Together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Before going to bed, I called Grace once more. I have made my decision, I told her. I will not argue with anyone. I will not accuse anyone. I will simply allow everyone to believe that everything is going exactly as they expect. Grace remained silent for a moment before replying with quiet confidence. Your husband always admired your patience, Margaret. Sometimes patience allows the truth to walk into the room without being invited. I smiled for the first time in many days because I finally understood that I did not need to convince anyone of anything. All I had to do was wait while each person continued writing the ending to their own story. Over the following week, I made no effort to change anyone's opinion of me. If Daniel believed I was beginning to accept his plans, I allowed him to keep believing it. If Rebecca assumed I had quietly surrendered control of my own future, I never challenged that assumption. There was a strange kind of peace in no longer trying to correct people who had already decided who I was. Every few days, Daniel called to ask how I was doing. He sounded attentive, but every conversation eventually drifted toward practical matters. He asked whether I had thought about downsizing. He mentioned how expensive it must be to maintain an older home. He even offered to help organize my paperwork after the new year. I thanked him sincerely each time. The more agreeable I became, the more confident he sounded. Rebecca soon began texting me links to retirement communities with beautiful gardens, fitness centers, and holiday activities. Her messages were carefully written, almost as though she expected someone else might read them one day. She always described the move as something that would make life easier for me. She never once asked whether leaving the home my husband and I had built together was something I actually wanted. Meanwhile, Grace and I met quietly twice more. We reviewed every document with patience and precision. She explained each provision in language that was easy to understand, making certain I never felt rushed. My husband had arranged everything with remarkable care. None of the documents were designed to punish anyone. Instead, they ensured that his wishes could not be quietly ignored if circumstances changed after his passing. As I listened, I realized that he had never tried to control the future. He had simply tried to protect the values that had shaped our family for decades. One afternoon, I opened an old photo album while searching for a tax receipt. Inside were pictures from Christmas celebrations stretching back more than 30 years. Daniel appeared in nearly every photograph wearing the same wide smile, proudly standing beside the tree he had helped decorate with his father. Rebecca entered the album much later, smiling just as brightly during her first holiday with us. Looking at those photographs, I felt sadness rather than anger. Somewhere along the way, priorities had quietly shifted. Gratitude had slowly given way to expectation. Before closing the album, I found one final photograph that had slipped loose from its page. It showed my husband placing the star on top of the Christmas tree while Daniel studied the ladder below. Across the back, in my husband's handwriting, were 6 simple words. Protect what matters, not what sparkles. I placed the photograph beside his letter inside the envelope Grace had returned to me. That evening I called Daniel and invited everyone to dinner the following Saturday. I think it is time we all sat down together, I said warmly. There are a few things your father wanted our family to remember, and I would like us to begin the new year with complete honesty. Daniel happily accepted without asking another question. After we ended the call, I looked toward the quiet dining room where the same table still waited beneath the soft glow of the chandelier. Soon every chair would be filled again, but this time the conversation would not be guided by assumptions. It would be guided by the truth my husband had carefully preserved long before any of us realized how much we would one day need it. Saturday evening arrived with the same quiet snowfall that had covered the neighborhood a week earlier, but this dinner felt entirely different. I prepared the table exactly as I always had, placing every plate, every glass, and every folded napkin where they belonged. This time I placed my own name card at the head of the table beside the chair my husband had always occupied. No one questioned it when they arrived. Daniel carried a bottle of sparkling cider, Rebecca brought another bakery dessert, and the children ran toward the living room, laughing as though the world had never changed. Grace arrived a few minutes later, dressed in a simple navy coat and carrying a slim leather folder. Rebecca looked surprised to see her but quickly recovered with a pleasant smile. I did not realize we were having company, she said. Grace was an old friend of your father-in-law and mine, I answered warmly. There are a few things he wanted our family to hear together. During dinner, conversation remained light. The grandchildren talked about school and winter break. Daniel discussed work, while Rebecca shared ideas for home improvement projects. I listened more than I spoke. For the first time in weeks, I no longer felt the need to defend my place at the table. I already knew where I belonged. After dessert, I gently folded my napkin and looked toward Grace. She opened the leather folder and placed several documents on the table with calm professionalism. The room became quiet. Before his passing, Grace began. Margaret's husband asked me to preserve these documents until the appropriate time. He believed that family should always be built on respect rather than expectation. She first read a short letter written in his own words. He thanked every member of the family for the years they had shared together and expressed his hope that kindness would always guide future decisions. Then Grace explained the trust he had established years earlier. The family home would remain under the trust according to his written instructions, ensuring that Margaret would always have complete security and the freedom to decide her own future. No one else had the authority to make those decisions for her. Daniel's expression slowly changed from confidence to thoughtful silence. Rebecca remained perfectly still, listening without interruption. Grace continued by explaining that the remaining family assets were to be distributed only after every condition outlined by my husband had been honored. Those conditions focused not on wealth, but on responsibility, honesty, and respect for one another. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, and no harsh accusations. There did not need to be. The documents spoke more clearly than anger ever could. Daniel finally looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had only moments before. Mom, he said quietly, I should have listened more carefully instead of assuming I knew what was best for you. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. The greatest inheritance your father hoped to leave you was never this house, I said softly. It was the ability to remember that people matter more than possessions. The room remained silent for several seconds. Outside, snow continued falling beneath the porch light, covering the driveway in a fresh layer of white. I looked around the table and realized that peace does not always arrive through winning an argument. Sometimes it arrives when the truth quietly takes its rightful seat, allowing everyone to see one another clearly again. That evening, I slipped the little place card marked guest into the fireplace and watched it disappear. I no longer needed the reminder because I finally understood something my husband had known all along. A home is not defined by the opinions of those who forget your worth. It is defined by the courage to remember it yourself.